Hey, are you hiring? If you answered yes, let XenTegra Staffing help staff your IT people needs. Head over to XenTegra.com/XenTegra Staffing to find out more. XenTegra Staffing, we can staff your IT people needs. Welcome to another edition of the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton, your source for all things Citrix.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 47 of the Citrix Session podcast. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got Bill Sutton with me, Bill, Director of Services here at XenTegra. Bill, how's it going?
Going well, Andy. Very well. How about you?
I'm good. Did you survive the hurricane over the weekend? Did you guys get much impact from that?
We got a good bit of rain, but it's still kind of overcast and drizzling right now on a Monday, but wasn't as bad as the last one that came through, which just deluged us. So Good for the grass. I just had it aerated and seeded, so really good for the grass.
That's good. Yeah, that's the thing about the falls here in the Southeast. We get plenty of hurricanes that have lost a lot of their punch by the time they get here, but a lot of rain, sometimes too much, but fills up the reservoirs.
That's right.
There's a reason why this place is so green, and we're not tropical. We're not tropical. We're subtropical here in the Southeast. Is that what's called?
Probably, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was talking to my son last night, and I couldn't remember the climates. I need to go back to elementary school. It's amazing what you learn along the way that you forget. You think would just be common knowledge, and at some point you just forget.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's one thing about kids when in school is sometimes you end up relearning that stuff.
Yeah,
I've had some aha moments with my kids.
Yeah, and it actually hits this time and makes sense. Oh, that's why we learned it that way.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? That leads actually into this conversation really well. We're going to do something different today. It's something I love to do. And we are going to stop and learn how Citrix communicates. And we're going to do that using a CTX article. So instead of a blog, we're going to look at a CTX article because, I feel certain that if you stopped and asked me how the ICA and the authentication traffic flow happens depending on the scenario, and it changes depending on the scenario, I bet I would get pieces of it wrong. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to go really kind of geeky on the Citrix side of things, and we're going to review this article. It's CTX 236889. It's called Application and Desktop Launch Process for Internal Network. And what that means, it means using the Citrix Workspace app, or what used to be called Receiver, and talking to a storefront server enabled environment. And we're going to go through what happens and how it happens, and maybe some tidbits along the way as to what we think people should know that maybe they don't know as we go through it.
Yeah, I've looked through this, of course, in advance of this podcast. I actually had to address this with a customer maybe 2 weeks ago. And there's some things in here that I didn't mention that I don't know that are absolutely critical, but nevertheless, it's amazing what going back and reviewing some of this stuff will do for you in terms of making sure you get it right.
And the thing is, this one's fairly up to date. This is July of this year when it was last updated, and things change, right? And so what you do back in 2003 and P and Agent and how it communicated with a web interface server or Infuse, all that good stuff, right? That changes and evolves. And depends on what the scenario is a little bit. This pretty much works on all the different devices. But yeah, I hope people appreciate this, especially those that are listening to this podcast for the more technical side of life. So the stated objective is to understand the process flow to help understand and troubleshoot the scenario. And I'm going to add a bit to that. This is under the assumption that this is an internal network using Citrix non-cloud, so not CVAD service, but what we would call CVAD on-prem these days still. Maybe we'll do this again in the coming weeks and talk about how this would flow depending on various different configurations using the service. But this is specifically for the Workspace app also called receiver. And in fact, I think they even call it receiver in this document, and how it communicates with the internal Citrix environment. And by internal, I mean something that's on your private network. It could be your WAN. It doesn't have to be the LAN, but something on your internal LAN, WAN private network. So, Bill, before we jump in, any pieces you want to add to what we're covering here?
No, you hit it right on the head. I think, this is obviously, we're not necessarily involving any sort of Citrix gateway or anything here. This is strictly internal, hitting storefront.
Yeah. So here's the steps, right? The first section of what it's calling instructions is the original conversation around authentication. So what the article points out, it's got a really nice drawing that has a number 1, a number 2, a number 3, 4, 5, and 6. But number 1, the Workspace app is launched, and it reaches out to contact the storefront server on port 80 or port 443. Of course, 443 is HTTPS. You want to stop there and just point out the first obvious thing that needs to happen?
Yeah, it should be 443. You want to make sure you're securing the connectivity between the endpoint Workspace app and your storefront server, since the user is going to have to likely enter credentials there. It's a best practice to secure that on 443 so that they can't be intercepted.
And if you did 10 of our free XenTegra assessments, how many times would you find it being over 80? Too many, right?
Too many. Yeah. At least half, probably more than that, probably in the 60 to 70% range would be our typical finding.
And it used to be that by default, Citrix made it 80, and I think now you can still do it, but by default, it at least warns you that it's on 80. So that it really
does. Yeah, if you go to configure your controller in storefront and you set it on HTTP, it'll put a little yield symbol or a little flag up there that says this is not secure. So they're definitely trying to steer you in the right direction there.
Yeah, we used to have a competitor here in the Carolinas. Their top consultant would go around. He would always implement port 80. And I would just come in behind him and point out the obvious problem with that. And it would give me a little bit of a foundation to try to win over a client in that scenario.
Yeah, such a simple thing, but critical.
All right, step 2 says the storefront presents an authentication page. Well, all of a sudden the lines just got murky because that's not actually... I don't know if that's actually true in the case of the Workspace app. That would be in the case where you reached out to a web page on the storefront server. But I think in the case of this, the app itself generates the login UI and is prepared to pass that along. So already we found an anomaly in what they've got here, which isn't accurate because in this case, we're reaching out via the app in this article, not via a web browser, which is very common in the Citrix world. But so in theory, number 2 that they have here is wrong in my opinion. It's actually the Workspace app that generates the username login boxes.
Yeah, the storefront server would basically instruct the Workspace app to present an authentication dialog box. So storefront is technically not presenting a page as if a user were going to a web browser. You're absolutely right. I noticed that as well.
And then number 3, in this case, it doesn't say this. I'm going to put the words into the article. It says user submits credentials. So the user inputs their credentials into the Workspace app, hits enter, and then the Workspace app submits the credentials to the storefront, again, over HTTPS. And the storefront takes that information. And then step 4, the storefront reaches out via Kerberos using TCP port 88 to authenticate to the Active Directory server that's in place, right?
Exactly. Yep.
The Active Directory returns in its normal Kerberos way to the storefront the reality of that username password attempt, and the user will then be presented. The user will then be told from the storefront that he has successfully or unsuccessfully authenticated. If successful, the next step happens. If unsuccessful, the user is challenged to try again, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Question for you: when that happens, since it's the storefront reaching out to the Active Directory, if you have a lockout policy set to lock out the user after X number of bad attempts, will that apply?
Yes.
And then, of course, all your password, credential policies of complexity and things like that, those are all still in play too, right?
They're still in place, and if you have the password change feature turned on Storefront, which we would generally recommend, then and your password is set to change or has expired, then it will prompt you to change it there, and all that communication happens via Kerberos.
So now let's talk about an example we ran into earlier this year where we were using iGel, which is a Ubuntu Linux, and their Kerberos implementation was a certain iteration of it, and the user was challenged to reset their password or use complex password. I think it was password complexity requirements.
Yeah.
And the storefront would respond back to the iGel unit, aka Linux, and it would not know what to do with it. So it would just say, "Go ahead, enter whatever complexity you want, or reuse a previous password." So, while it seems like this is very Citrix centric, there's a lot of underlying pieces like Kerberos that come into play, right?
That's right. Yeah, especially around authentication. Kerberos is a pretty complex beast. It's highly secure, and there's a lot of ticket exchange and token exchange that occurs there. So it's pretty complex, and lots can go wrong if it's not configured correctly.
Yeah, so let's take a walk down memory road. For me, I used to do Active Directory support at Microsoft 20 years ago. Man, hard to even say that, but almost 20 years ago. And the way Kerberos finally made sense to me was in the case of going to a nightclub. So my social security card and my passport issued by the federal government allowed me to go to my driver's license office and get a state ID. So that was my ticket granting ticket system. And then I could go present that state issued ID to a bouncer at a nightclub and get into a nightclub and enjoy myself at the nightclub. That was the ticket granting system that was derived from the federal government's ID system that allowed me to go get a stamp on my hand so that I could spend 24 hours, only 24 hours at a nightclub. That's how Kerberos works.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy.
Well, it's the one that made sense to me. Still does, but at the time made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
I could relate every Thursday, Friday, Saturday night. All right, so now that we've authenticated our user, the next section here is called resource enumeration. This is where it gets more interesting. So the idea here is we want to retrieve the applications and desktops, which in the world of Citrix these days goes beyond just Windows 32 desktops and Win32 apps. Also includes SaaS apps, which that generates a whole lot of other conversation. But for the sake of this conversation, we'll stick to published apps, published desktops, VDI apps, VDI desktops, which one of these days we're going to do a podcast on VDI apps, client-hosted apps, to make sure people know what that's all about, because it's really cool. So just to walk through the steps here, it's got, so I'll just read it. After successful authentication, storefront passes user credentials to the delivery controller on behalf of the user over port 80 or 443. Again, we'll stop and point out that it should always be 443, but not totally uncommon for it not to be. Let's see, let me finish reading it. For the list of applications, the delivery controller responds back or contacts AD over LDAP, port TCP 389. To identify the user's identity and group memberships. The controller contacts the site database. So we're talking about the XenApps and Desktop CVAD site database, which is going to be stored on a SQL server somewhere, either SQL, full-blown SQL, or SQL Express. Contacts that information, finds the metadata associated with that username or group the user's a member of. And then the delivery controller sends the information back to the storefront server, again over 80 or 443, ideally 443. The storefront then presents that information directly to the workspace app where the end user is communicating from. Now, a lot happens there, right? So a lot of chances for things to go wrong. That's why things take a little while to enumerate sometimes. But that's That's what's happening during that process where the user finally sees icons on their screen. Any additional facts to add to that?
Well, the only thing I would add is if you review that section, you'll note the delivery controller is involved a great deal in this process. So obviously you want to secure that. And of course, you want it to be highly available because it's not just a management framework. It's also involved in the enumeration of your resources via storefront.
So this is probably a good time to point out that in some small environments, they'll put the storefront services and the delivery controller services on the same system.
Correct.
Which is fine up until a certain scale, but ideally you want those things separated. You want them on separate boxes. Oh, we haven't talked at all about putting what should we put in front of all these things to make sure we're highly available.
Oh yeah, of course, an ADC or what used to be called NetScaler.
So some type of load balancer. Ideally, you use the Citrix one because you're in that world. And a lot of people do. But some type of load balancing based off of some type of persistence around cookies or something, so that the user has a high availability aspect of this piece, which is similar to every other type of application load balancing where it's not built in. You need to put something smart in front of it.
Exactly.
Well. And since I said that, that's a good time to probably add something smart means something that can do this type of query and get back a positive result and use that as the checksum of whether it's available or not just something that pings it, which, if you did an assessment, a XenTegra free assessment, what percentage of the time you think you'd find some kind of very basic load balancing method in place?
Oh, it's pretty common. Customers that are using ADC, a lot of times the default monitor is just the TCP monitor, the default TCP monitor, which is really nothing more than a SYNAC, the old underlying communication that TCP uses. And what you really need to do is, whether it's a NetScaler or an ADC or some other ADC, you want that intelligence. You want to be able to query that storefront server to make sure it responds the way it needs to enumerate the resources. And there's numbers of ways to do that. Looking for an OK coming back from the web service, but even that's probably not going to be enough. You need to go deeper. Ideally, you want to authenticate and make sure that it returns an OK from the authentication. That'll tell you that the storefront service is running.
Yeah, what was XML black hole? That's the thing where we could talk to it. It would do a TCP handshake. It would do a ping. It would even do some type of session state acceptability, but it would return garbage. XML black hole. How many times did you run into that?
Oh, all the time back in the day. Probably very frequently. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I can say I only ran into it once, and it was kind of fun when I ran into it because it was like, hey, finally, I get to see what everybody's been saying could possibly happen all these years. So a little bit of validation there, finally, after telling people for years that would happen.
Yep.
All right, so as the listeners can tell, there's a lot that goes on already, and we haven't even attempted to launch an app yet. Now we're going to do that. So the next section here is section 3. Is called resource launch, and this is when the user actually clicky. That's what my Unix admins used to. That's how they used to tell me I used to administer systems. I used clicky. So user clicks on an icon or right clicks and hits open. And let's see, user clicks on the icon shown in the store. So ports 80 and 443, reaches out to the storefront. Storefront contacts the delivery controller over 80 or 443. Again, let's use 443 if it's not in the lab, just in general. Delivery controller reaches out to a SQL server to identify the most suitable VDA. So VDA would be the virtual delivery agent. That's the host, right? That's the host that is least something. By default, it's least number of users, but you can set up all kinds of policies within Citrix to base that on the amount of resources available. Which is also another interesting conversation because there's been plenty of time, and I've done it to myself twice, where I've actually tried to get smart and become more advanced on how I determined which VDA or which host should be used, and I've completely locked down entire environments, not knowing that I put a bad policy in place.
Right.
All right. So now that we've talked to the SQL server, found out which was the most available at that moment, VDA, the delivery controller contacts that VDA on port 80 And the VDA returns a session key to the delivery controller. The delivery controller sends the session key that contains all the connection information to the storefront server, and the storefront server puts all that connection information into and this is the fun part, a default.ica file, and sends the endpoints and sends it to the endpoint again over 80 or best 443. That ICA file thing, that's gold when you're trying to troubleshoot connection issues and you're trying to see, where you're being directed over what ports. How many times you had to pull that thing apart with Notepad or WordPad and figure out what was going on.
Yeah, it's a little bit more difficult to do today, but it can still be done. I've had to pull it apart myself, to see what IP it's putting in it and other elements of it. So, yeah, I've had to pull it apart a few times.
When you say it's more difficult today than it used to be, let's assume we're talking about a simple situation here where we're connecting over a private network. Is there something about it that you can't look at it the way you used to be able to? What's different today?
It's just a little bit more difficult to get it because it actually leverages an HTTPS connection in the browser itself, and then you actually have to turn off the file type association in order to see it. Or how in Chrome, or I think even the new Edge, which is based on Chromium, when you launch it for the first time, it asks you whether you want to associate it. If you don't, then you'll see the ICA file. Otherwise, it just kind of flows all the way through. If you were to try to right click on the page, or right click on the icon in Storefront, you would get basically just a web page as opposed to a HTML code as opposed to the ICA file.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because that's a key piece of information here, right? You got to go old school. You got to disassociate ICA files. They don't automatically launch. You have that moment where you can stop and get it long enough to take a look at what's inside it. That includes, ideally, the host name, right? There was a point in time where it gave you by IP, and there was some challenges with that. These days, is it by host name by default, or do you have to turn that on?
It's I think the default is host name, but you can switch it to IP. That's been a troubleshooting step that some folks have, and there's an option within Storefront to set it to use IP as opposed to DNS. But I think the default now, maybe for a while, has been the full host name.
I remember that being a best practice. One of our consultants, Ted Hoffman, used to implement that all the time, and I go behind him and notice that and talk to him one day about it, and it sounds like that was the best way. As long as you got a functioning DNS that isn't an issue, that creates a whole other challenge.
Yeah, you might want to swap your audio or something out, Andy. You're getting a little bit choppy there. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't have anything I can do at this point other than stop sharing my screen. I'll do that. How's it now, Bill?
About the same. It's try it again.
I don't know if it'll help for you to stop your video, but I don't have anything else I can do at this point.
Okay.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah, maybe switch off audio and switch back in. Switch to phone and back into, if you can do that.
Yep. How about now, Bill?
It's the same. It's not really choppy. It's more like there's a bug in your throat or something. I can still understand you. It's just a little, there you go.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Maybe that'll help.
Okay.
All right. We're at step 4 here called session initialization. And this is when we actually launch the app. So the Citrix Workspace app on the endpoint, which, by the way, when we get into this point in really after the first section, whether using a browser or using the Workspace app, same things happen. In this case, we're talking about using the Workspace app to launch the application. I think it's sometimes great to pause and make sure people understand there's really 3 ways in general to launch a Citrix hosted app. One is using the Workspace app to communicate and then to launch the ICA file. The other is to use a browser to communicate, and then once you click on the icon in the browser, it will launch the Workspace app, aka receiver, and make the session connection. And then there's the HTML5 Workspace app, where it actually launches inside the browser itself, an HTML5 browser, and that doesn't require any type of clients. It's limited in terms of feature capabilities, but it doesn't require any type of clients other than an HTML5 browser. And a lot of that launch information and application Citrix stuff happens right inside the browser itself. But not to be confused there. What we're talking about here is the Workspace app. So the Workspace app talks directly to the VDA over, by default, 20-port TCP. Well, you know what? Let's talk about that, because I don't know if that's necessarily true anymore. It talks to the Workspace app, talks to the VDA over probably UDP 2598 by default, assuming you have adaptive display ADT, inline display transport enabled. By default, it should be 2598 UDP at this point, right, Bill?
That's right. Yep. Should start with UDP 2598 to enable what is it? Enlightened data transport, which you just said. That's the UDP-based transport that helps with performance and the user interaction.
So I guess there's two things to talk about. One is UDP by default, so that the application flow is handled at the application layer, and things like audio, video, bidirectional audio really can be kind of smoothed over and even jumbled up if necessary. I think we just had the problem here on this conference where I was garbled up, but you would rather me be garbled up than just totally disappear on you. That's what Citrix does by default until it starts to recognize that maybe TCP would be the better option in order to give the user a usable experience. So there's really two things going on. One is UDP that can fall back to TCP. Ideally, it doesn't. Probably takes up more bandwidth, but we got a lot of bandwidth these days. And then we're on 2598, which is session reliability, where we're wrapping the protocol into an additional set of packets to make sure the protocol stays alive over a bad network. You want to talk any further about session reliability and what that does?
Yeah, session reliability, which is port 2598 by default, is basically this is you've got a connection going on between the endpoint and the VDA. So your application's launched or desktop's launched, and there's an intermittent blip in network connectivity. The most common blip would be moving from one wireless access point to another wireless access point. The screen will go gray, but if the user's typing, it'll cache the keystrokes. And then when the session reconnects, it comes right back. So it's designed to prevent the session from completely going away and, quite honestly, really upsetting the user because they think they've lost everything, even though it's still sitting on the server. So session reliability mitigates intermittent connectivity issues by not removing the session from the user's field of view.
So I had this conversation with a client, I think you might have on the call a week ago or so, where they have a network that they don't trust, which is really bad when it's a private, internal network, and they wanted to make sure they were using 2598. My guidance to them was, if you don't trust that network, don't turn that on, or make sure you turn it off, because if you turn it on, in those cases, you're just masking the fact that you have underlying network issues. Right. And now all of a sudden the problem becomes yours, and everybody blames you at Citrix because sessions are freezing. And really, it's the network drops, and Citrix is just doing everything it can to keep it alive so that users don't have to re-authenticate.
Yeah, the example that I've always used for this is nurses on medical carts wheeling them down the hallway in a hospital. In the old days before session reliability, if there was a blip in the wireless network that those things were connected to, the session would just go away. And then they'd have to reconnect to the session. Session reliability helped mitigate that by just sending it gray for a couple of seconds while it converged on a new access point. Probably not as critical today. And usually if you see a lot of that, you're right. You've got network problems that are underlying it, and you need to address those first.
Yeah, it used to be that Citrix was one of the only applications on the network that required real-time delivery, and everything else was kind of send and wait. But now lots of applications are that way. So I have a quick story. I had a county government that had a bad Citrix implementation. They blamed Citrix for everything. Turns out they had a bad network, and when they redid their intranet, they recognized that and fixed their intranet, their network. And all of a sudden, all the Citrix problems went away. And to this day, they still blame Citrix for being a bad product. And truthfully, with their network, they just wouldn't own up to it. And to this day, they have yet to implement Citrix the way they should have. I have a question for you. What's the difference? And if you don't know, it's fine. You have got session reliability. And then what is ICA keep alive? What's the differences between those two, or are they part of the same thing?
I'll probably get this wrong, but they are not the same thing. ICA keep alive, I believe, is how long the session would they're mutually exclusive, I believe. So if you turn session reliability on, ICA keep alive, even if it's on, doesn't really enter into the picture. At least I believe that's the case. If you turn session reliability off and ICA keep alive's on, which I think are on by default, ICA keep alive, I believe, is the amount of time that it keeps that session active before it goes into a disconnected state on the server in the event of a disconnect.
Yeah, I've always struggled with that one. Didn't understand it. Maybe somebody who's listening can send us a message. Let us know.
Yeah.
All right, where did I leave off? Okay, contacts, the VDA notifies the delivery controller contacts the light. I know I didn't get this part. The VDA notifies the delivery controller of the connection setup. And then the delivery controller contacts the licensor, first time we talked about licensing, to check out the license on behalf of the user or device at that moment, which gets really important when we start talking about concurrent licensing versus user device licensing. The next step here, delivery controller commits session connection information to the site database. So now it's in the metadata, and then the user interacts with the app or desktop over TCP, UDP. So UDP 2598 by default. And then they're happily working away until they either decide to disconnect, log off, or something happens different.
Exactly. Yep, that's right.
So a little bit of extra stuff. I actually didn't get into this part prior to this, but so additional resources problems may occur during the following processes: authentication. User cannot log in, check their AD credentials, cannot enumeration. If you see no apps, it probably means that you authenticated fine. You just don't have the right associations. User has not been assigned any resources. Storefront access to the DDC was unavailable. DDC has a problem communicating. All of that stuff you can go look on the event logs. And I think it's the application event logs within Windows and find information pointing to an issue with the storefront not being able to talk to the delivery controller.
Yeah, you can look in the event log under, like you said, under the app log, but there's also a delivery services log under other or additional app logs that you can look in that'll give you details on storefront's involvement with the delivery controllers as well as other parts of the infrastructure.
And that's always driven me nuts that some applications will put stuff into the Windows default application log, and then some will have their own generated set of event logs. I guess this is how the world works. You pick and choose. Okay, resource launch process, no ICA file downloaded, or like we talked about, pull everything apart with a text editor and figure out what's in there. Session initialization. We've had lots of scenarios there where more than likely the first thing I check is one or two things. Does the machine delivery group for the app or desktop associated catalog have available resources registered and waiting? Not uncommon to go look in there and see a bunch of machines piled up and not registered, and then you're off to the next step to figure out why they're not registered and ready to wait. I actually had that problem this morning in my lab. Or
DNS issue, typically.
DNS
Not always. I said it was normally a DNS issue, but not always.
Not always, yeah. A lot of DNS issues. There's a product from Citrix, I assume it's still available, called XDP, which you go run that, I guess, on the VDA, and it'll tell you, why it can't get there. And also another good idea looking, I think, the application log on the controller and the VDA, and one will be talking bad about the other, or they'll both be talking bad about each other.
Yeah.
That brings us to this article. I hope this was helpful to people. Honestly, it helped me to walk back through it and learn it. And every client I engage on the customer success side of things, I really just need to make sure they totally understand this, because you can't troubleshoot this stuff if you don't know what happens step by step.
That's right. Absolutely. It's critical to being able to troubleshoot is to understand what's happening in each phase. Helps you isolate where it might be breaking.
I forget what I realized. Something I did with my kids, and my youngest son, we were doing a math problem the other day, and he wrote down the problem wrong. And I was like, look, son, you chances are, if you did something silly along the way, which is where the problem lies, as human beings, we're all guilty of overthinking things right out the gate. And more often than not, it's something simple, way more often than not. The way that sales guy one time that he used to joke around with some of the clients that couldn't get Citrix implemented or couldn't use it properly or wouldn't get it to the place where they wanted it. He used to joke that they must have got the bad code. And the truth is, everybody gets the same code. If it doesn't work, it should work for anybody. If it doesn't work for you, then start looking at the basics and figuring out where it's, what the anomaly is, probably on your side, not the software.
Typically, yep.
There are the rare occasions where there truly are bugs, and there are the rare occasions where somebody doesn't implement something correctly that was a paid professional. But look, there's a lot of decision trees in these projects. I like to jokingly say I could go implement a project the best I could today. I could come back 2 weeks later and look at it and be like, oh, what the heck? Why did I do that? What's that for? Whose decision was this? This doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Seen that too, yeah.
It's when you get the guys who already know it all. Those are the ones you got to be scared of.
That's right.
All right, so is there anything else you'd like to cover before we adjourn for the session?
No, I think we've covered it all pretty well.
It's a little unique. We'll go back to our regular blog type thing here in the coming weeks, but we'll jump out and get kind of techy every once in a while and keep it interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great thing to do, and it helps us as much as it helps our listeners.
It does, and it helps to remind. And we should probably do this on Citrix Cloud and take some basic use case, because that evolves, and that can be very different depending on the implementation.
Yeah.
That's one that you almost need to be in front of a whiteboard to make sure people are getting it, but certainly something that maybe hosts to do at a later date.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that would be very helpful.
All right, Bill. Well, thanks for the time, and we'll see you again next week.
All right, Andy.
Thank you for listening to the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton. A special thanks to our guest for attending today's podcast. Podcast produced by Pete Downing. For any input, or if you'd like to be a part of our podcast, please email us at info@XenTegra.com. Please head over to XenTegra.com/podcast to listen to all podcasts in this series. This podcast is copyrighted by XenTegra LLC.